They served with honor, but no one came to take them home. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold metal, the kind that clung to your lungs and never quite left. And under the harsh fluorescent lights, a line of aging German shepherds stood quietly behind steel bars, their bodies still, their eyes alert in that way only trained K9s could be, watching every movement as if waiting for a command that would never come. And at the far end of the corridor, a handler gently clipped a leash onto the collar of one of them, a gray-muzzled shepherd, whose once dark coat had faded into patches of silver and tan, his breathing steady but slow, his posture disciplined even now. And yet something in his eyes lingered at the doorway, not fear, not confusion, but a quiet question, as if he had spent years learning to trust that door would always lead him back to his partner, back to purpose, back to home. And today, it simply didn't. The leash gave a soft tug, the sound of it brushing against the concrete floor echoing in the stillness, and the dog hesitated, just for a second, not resisting, not disobeying, just waiting, his ears twitching toward the entrance as if catching a scent carried on memory alone. And the handler paused, glancing down with a breath that lingered too long, because they all knew what came next even if no one said it out loud. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched low across the parking lot, casting long shadows that crept through the narrow windows and painted faint bars of gold across the floor, touching the edges of cages that had once held heroes. And somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, sharp and sudden. Footsteps followed, heavy, deliberate, cutting through the quiet like something out of place. And then the front door opened, the hinges letting out a low groan that turned every head in the room at once. Ears lifting, bodies shifting, a ripple of attention moving through the corridor like a current. Because even after years of service, even after being left behind, they still responded to presence, to possibility, to the idea that someone might be coming back for them. And in that doorway stood a man, broad-shouldered, mid-30s, his posture straight but tired in a way that didn't show on the surface, his boots leaving faint marks on the polished floor as he stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the room, not quickly, not casually, but slowly, deliberately, as if he were counting something no one else could see. And for a moment, no one spoke, the handler at the end of the hall still holding the leash, the dog still standing there, caught between obedience and instinct, and the man's eyes stopped on him. Just for a second, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something that didn't need words, didn't need explanation, just recognition. And then the man took another step forward, his voice low but firm, cutting clean through the sterile air. Stop. The handler froze, the leash slackened slightly, and the dog lifted his head, ears forward now, eyes locked, as if that single word had reached deeper than any command he'd heard in years. And the room held its breath, suspended in that fragile moment where everything could still change, where a door that had only ever closed might finally open again. And somewhere beneath the hum of the lights and the distant echo of traffic outside, something shifted, quiet and almost invisible, like the first crack in a wall that had stood too long. Because sometimes it doesn't take a miracle to begin. Sometimes it only takes one voice willing to say no when the world has already decided yes. The word lingered in the air long after it was spoken, as if the walls themselves were not ready to let it go. And for a moment no one moved. Not the handler, not the man, not even the dog whose leash had gone slack in a quiet surrender, until the handler cleared his throat softly, uncertain, his voice lower now, almost respectful. "Sir, this one is scheduled." And the man stepped closer, the sound of his boots steady against the floor, each step measured, each breath controlled like someone who had learned long ago how to carry weight without letting it show. And when he stopped just a few feet away, the German shepherd lifted his head fully, ears forward, eyes searching the man's face with a kind of focus that had once been reserved for commands in the field. And the man met that gaze without hesitation, not as a stranger, but as if he understood something written beneath the surface, something older than this room, older than the uniforms, something earned. And then he reached out, slowly, giving the dog time to choose, his hand open, steady, and the shepherd did not step back, did not growl, did not flinch. Instead, he leaned forward just enough for his nose to brush against the man's fingers, a brief contact. light as breath, but heavy with meaning. And the handler exhaled quietly, shaking his head just once as if the moment had already said everything that needed to be said. He used to work explosives detection, he added, almost as an explanation, almost as a defense. 9 years of service. And the man nodded, his eyes never leaving the dog. What is his name? He asked, and there was a pause, a small one, but long enough to matter, before the handler answered, Rex, and something in the man's expression shifted, not visibly, not in a way most would notice, but enough that his shoulders squared just a fraction more, as if the name carried weight of its own, and he repeated it softly. Rex, like a promise being remembered rather than spoken, and then he straightened, turning his gaze down the line of kennels, taking in the others, the ones who had stepped closer to the bars, the ones who stayed back in quiet observation, the ones who had stopped expecting anything at all, and the room seemed smaller now, tighter, filled with something unspoken pressing against every surface. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, did not harden. It simply held, steady and certain. How many? He asked, and the handler blinked, caught off guard, glancing down the corridor as if counting for the first time. 17, he said. All retired this quarter. And the number hung there, heavier than it should have been, heavier than numbers ever are when they belong to lives, and the man nodded once, slow, deliberate, and for a moment it looked as though he might say something else, something practical, something reasonable, but instead he turned back to Rex, to the leash, to the quiet. Question still lingering in the dog's eyes, and without looking away he spoke the words that would shift everything that followed. I will take them, he said, and the handler frowned slightly, uncertain. You mean this one? He asked, gesturing toward Rex. But the man shook his head, just once, his tone unchanged. No, he said. All of them. And the silence that followed was different this time. Not empty, not uncertain, but full. Like the moment before a storm breaks or a door finally opens. After years of being closed, and somewhere down the line a dog let out a soft breath, barely audible, but enough to ripple through the stillness. Because even without understanding the words, they felt the shift, the change in something unseen, and the handler looked at him again, really looked this time, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that might make the statement less real, but found none. Only a quiet resolve that did not ask for approval, did not wait for permission, and in that moment, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the fading warmth of the setting sun, something long forgotten began to stir, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like the first sign that maybe, just maybe, none of them had been forgotten after all. The words did not echo this time. They settled, heavy and real, pressing into the room in a way that made even the hum of the lights feel distant. And for a long second no one answered, not because they did not hear him, but because they were trying to understand what he had just said, because people did not say things like that. Not here, not about dogs who had already been written off, and the handler shifted his weight, glancing down the corridor again as if the number might have changed. Since the last time he counted, 17, he repeated quietly, almost to himself, then looked back at the man. That is a lot of responsibility. And the man nodded once, not dismissing it, not underestimating it, just acknowledging the truth without letting it move him. I know, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was not a decision made in a moment. Even if it sounded like one, that somewhere behind those steady eyes was a history that had already done the weighing, already counted the cost, and decided anyway. And the handler hesitated, then tried again, more practical this time. Housing, medical care, food, that is going to run you thousands a month. And the man gave a faint exhale, not quite a sigh, more like the release of a thought already considered. Then I will figure it out, he replied, and his gaze moved again, slowly, from kennel to kennel, taking in the worn paws, the graying muzzles, the quiet discipline that had not left them even after everything else had. And something in his posture softened, just slightly, as if he were seeing not what they were now, but what they had been, what they still were beneath the surface. And Rex had not moved, still standing at the end of the leash, still watching. But now there was a shift in his stance, subtle but undeniable, his weight leaning forward just a fraction, his tail no longer still, but giving the smallest, almost hesitant motion. like a memory returning to a body that had learned not to expect anything. And the man noticed. Of course he did, because men like him always noticed the small things, the things that did not speak out loud. And he reached down, this time without hesitation, resting his hand gently along the side of Rex's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the fur. The steady rhythm of a life that had given everything it was asked to give and then been told it was no longer needed. And for a moment neither of them moved. Man and dog standing there in a silence that felt less like an ending and more like something waiting to begin. And the handler cleared his throat again, softer now. "There is paperwork," he said, almost apologetically. "Transfer forms, liability waivers, medical disclosures." And the man gave a small nod, his hand still resting on Rex. "Bring it," he said, and there was no hesitation. No glance toward the door, no second thought, just a quiet certainty that settled deeper with every second. And as the handler turned to retrieve the documents, the corridor seemed to shift again, not in structure, not in light, but in feeling, as if the air itself had changed. And down the line, one of the older shepherds stepped closer to the bars, pressing his nose through the gap just enough to catch the man's scent. Another followed, then another, a slow, cautious movement, not chaotic, not desperate, but curious, measured, like soldiers observing a new command they were not yet sure they were allowed to trust. And the man noticed them too, all of them, his gaze softening in a way that spoke without words. And he took a single step forward, away from Rex, just long enough to stand where they could see him clearly, where they could decide for themselves. And he did not call them, did not reach out. He simply stood there, present, steady, letting them come if they chose to. And one by one, they leaned closer, eyes meeting his, searching, measuring, remembering something they had not felt in a long time. And somewhere deep in that quiet exchange, something began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, like the first breath after holding it too long, like the first sign that maybe the story they thought was over had only been paused, waiting for someone willing to continue it. The paperwork arrived in a thin stack that felt heavier than it looked, each page carrying a quiet finality that had been signed too many times before. And the handler placed it on the metal counter near the entrance, the soft slap of paper against steel echoing faintly through the corridor. "Standard transfer," he said, though his voice no longer held the routine certainty it once did. And the man stepped forward, releasing Rex gently but not completely, his hand lingering for a second longer, as if to reassure both of them that he was not going anywhere. Then he picked up the pen, turning it once between his fingers, reading the first line without rushing, without skipping, because men like him understood that what mattered was not the ink, but the promise behind it. And the words were simple, legal, clean, stating ownership, responsibility, liability, but beneath them was something else, something unspoken, something that could not be written but would be carried all the same. And as he signed his name, Daniel Hayes, steady and clear, the sound of the pen moving across the page seemed louder than it should have been, like a line being drawn not just on paper, but between what had been and what would come next. And the handler watched in silence, arms crossed loosely, his posture no longer guarded, no longer distant, just present, as if witnessing something he did not quite know how to describe. And when the last page was signed, Daniel set the pen down gently, not with finality, but with intention, then looked up, meeting the handler's eyes. "When can I take them?" he asked, and the handler hesitated, not out of doubt, but because the answer had never mattered before. "Today," he said slowly, "if you are ready." And Daniel nodded once, as if there had never been another option, and the room shifted again, not in sound, not in light, but in something deeper, something that moved quietly through the line of kennels like a current. Because the word today did not belong here, not in a place where waiting had become the only constant, and yet it lingered now, real and immediate. And Rex stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg, a contact that was not accidental, not uncertain, but chosen. And Daniel glanced down, a faint breath leaving him as his hand returned to the dog's neck, grounding himself in something steady, something alive. And then the practical world returned in small pieces, the handler moving down the corridor, unlocking one kennel at a time, the sharp click of each latch, breaking the long-held silence, doors opening not to release, but to invite, and one by one the dogs stepped out, not rushing, not chaotic, but measured, disciplined, as if they were still on duty, still following an order they had been trained to trust, though none had been spoken, and Daniel stood still, allowing them space, allowing them time, his presence constant but not imposing, and they circled slowly, some keeping distance, others drawing closer, their noses catching his scent, their eyes reading something deeper than words, and in that quiet movement, something fragile began to take shape, not yet trust, not fully, but the beginning of it, the kind that grows in silence before it is ever seen. And outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lot, the light softer now, warmer, touching the edges of the doorway like a promise waiting just beyond reach, and the handler returned, holding a set of worn collars and leashes, placing them down beside Daniel. "They are yours," he said, and the words felt different this time, not like a transfer, not like an end, but like the beginning of something no one in that room had expected, and Daniel looked at the dogs, all 17 of them, standing in that narrow corridor that had once been their whole world, and for a moment, just a moment, the weight of it all pressed in, the cost, the uncertainty, the unknown path ahead, but it did not linger, because something stronger stood in its place, something quieter, something that did not need to speak to be understood, and he gave a small nod, more to himself than anyone else, then turned toward the open doorway, not walking yet, not calling them, just standing there, as if giving them the choice, and behind him, Paws shifted against the concrete, soft, hesitant at first, then one step, then another, the faint sound of movement following him toward the light, not commanded, not forced, but chosen, and in that moment, the corridor that had once held only endings began, quietly, to let go. The first step outside did not feel like freedom, it felt unfamiliar, like a memory half forgotten, and the air carried a different weight beyond the doorway, warmer, touched by the fading sun, carrying the scent of asphalt and distant traffic instead of steel and disinfectant, and Daniel paused just beyond the threshold, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that for them, this moment needed space, needed time to become real, and behind him the sound of paws on concrete slowed, hesitated, then resumed, one by one, until all 17 had crossed that invisible line between what they had known and what they did not yet understand, and Rex was the first to come fully to his side, his body no longer rigid but still alert, his gaze scanning the open space as if measuring it for threats that were no longer there, and the others spread out slightly, not straying far, forming a loose circle that seemed instinctive, protective, a habit formed over years of service, and Daniel watched them quietly, his eyes moving from one to the next, noting the stiffness in their joints, the cautious way they stepped, the way some stayed close to walls even when there were none, as if still expecting boundaries that no longer existed. And for a moment the reality settled in, not as doubt, but as weight. 17 lives, 17 stories, all now tied to his own. And he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small ring of keys, the metal glinting briefly in the low light as he turned toward the parking lot, where an older utility truck waited, its paint worn, its bed empty, and he exhaled slowly, almost quietly to himself. "We will make this work," not loud enough to be heard as a command, but steady enough to be felt, and he opened the back, lowering the tailgate with a soft thud, then stepped aside, not guiding, not pushing, just giving them the option, and for a moment none of them moved, not out of fear, but out of habit, waiting for instruction, waiting for clarity, and Daniel crouched slightly, resting one hand on the edge of the truck, his voice calm, even, the kind of tone that carried authority without force. "It is all right," he said, and Rex watched him closely, ears forward, reading more than the words, reading the space between them, and then, slowly, deliberately, Rex stepped forward, placing one paw on the tailgate, then another, his body rising into the bed of the truck with a quiet confidence that seemed to echo something long buried, and he turned once, looking back at the others, not barking, not calling, just standing there, present, and it was enough. One by one they followed, some slower than others, some pausing halfway before continuing, but all of them choosing to move, to step into something unknown because one of them had, and Daniel stood there, watching each one climb in, counting without thinking, feeling the shift in the air with every movement, until the last dog stepped up, smaller than the others, hesitant but determined, and when it was done, when all 17 were inside, the space that had once been empty now held something alive, something breathing, something that did not belong to the past anymore. And Daniel closed the tailgate gently, not locking it, not sealing it away, just securing it enough to hold them together, and he walked around to the driver's side, his hand brushing briefly against the worn metal of the door, a small, grounding gesture, before he climbed in, and as the engine turned over with a low, steady rumble, the dogs shifted slightly, adjusting to the vibration, to the movement, to the idea that they were going somewhere, not waiting anymore. And Daniel rested his hands on the wheel for a second longer than necessary, his eyes lifting to the horizon where the last of the sunlight stretched thin across the sky. And in that quiet pause, something old stirred beneath the surface, a memory not fully formed, not yet ready to return, but close, closer than it had been in a long time. And he drew in a slow breath, then let it out, shifting the truck into drive. And as the vehicle rolled forward, leaving the building behind, none of the dogs looked back, not one of them, as if some part of them already understood that whatever they had lost there no longer belonged to them, and whatever waited ahead, uncertain as it was, had already begun. The road stretched long and quiet beneath the fading light, the hum of the engine steady, almost soothing, as the truck carried them farther from everything they had known. And in the back, the dogs adjusted slowly, their bodies swaying with each turn, each stop, each subtle shift in motion, and though none of them barked, none of them cried, there was a quiet awareness among them, a shared understanding that something had changed, something irreversible. And Rex stood near the front of the bed, his stance firm despite the movement, his eyes fixed on the cab as if anchoring himself to the man inside. And Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel, his posture straight, his gaze steady on the road ahead, but his mind was not entirely there, because with every mile, the past began to surface, not all at once, not overwhelming, but in fragments, small pieces rising like echoes that refused to stay. Buried, the scent of dust and heat, the distant hum of machinery, the weight of silence before something unseen, and he tightened his grip on the wheel slightly, just enough to ground himself in the present. But the memory did not leave. It never truly did. It only waited, and Rex shifted in the back, stepping closer to the front panel, his body lowering slightly, as if sensing something beyond sound, beyond sight. Something carried in the air between them, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes from holding too much for too long. And the road curved gently, leading them out of the city limits where the lights thinned and the sky opened wider, deeper, the last traces of orange fading into a cool blue that stretched endlessly above. And the truck passed quiet fields and scattered homes, the kind of places where time moved slower, where the world felt less crowded, and finally, after miles that seemed both long and too short, Daniel turned onto a narrow gravel path, the tires crunching softly beneath him, and the dogs shifted again, their ears lifting, their bodies alert, not in fear, but in recognition of change. And at the end of the path stood a modest property, simple, worn, but open, a stretch of land bordered by a low wooden fence, with a small house set back just enough to feel private, just enough to breathe. And Daniel slowed the truck, bringing it to a stop near the edge of the yard. And for a moment he did not move, his hands resting on the wheel, his eyes taking in the space as if seeing it differently now, not as it had been, but as it would need to become. And in the back, the dogs waited, not impatient, not restless, just present, as they had always been trained to be. And Daniel opened the door, stepping out into the cool evening air, the scent of grass and earth replacing the sterile traces of the facility, and he walked to the back, lowering the tailgate with the same care as before. And again he stepped aside, giving them space, giving them choice. And Rex was the first to move. Of course he was, stepping down onto the gravel with a steady, controlled motion, his paws meeting the ground with a quiet certainty. And he paused, lifting his head, taking in the scent of the land, the open air, the absence of walls. And one by one, the others followed, slower this time, more cautious, stepping into a world that had no boundaries, no clear edges, and they spread out slightly, not far, always within sight of Daniel, forming that same loose circle, but wider now, more open, and Daniel watched them, his chest rising and falling with a slow, measured rhythm, because this was where the real work began, not in the decision, not in the rescue, but in what came after, in the quiet rebuilding of something that had been taken piece by piece. And he took a step forward, his boots pressing into the gravel, and for a moment, just a moment, Rex looked at him in a way that felt different, not just alert, not just trained, but searching, as if asking a question that had no words, and Daniel met that gaze without hesitation, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough warmth to reach them. "You are home," he said. And the word hung there, unfamiliar, fragile, but real, and none of them moved immediately, not because they did not understand, but because they were learning how to believe it. The word home did not settle easily. It lingered in the air like something too fragile to touch, and the dogs stood scattered across the gravel and thin patches of grass, their bodies still, their eyes moving, adjusting, measuring a world that had no walls to define it. And for a while no one moved, not Daniel, not Rex, not the others, as if the silence itself needed time to reshape around them. And then a breeze passed through the open field, carrying the scent of earth and dry leaves, brushing lightly through their fur, and something shifted, small at first, almost invisible. One of the older shepherds lowered his head, sniffing the ground with slow curiosity. Another took a few cautious steps forward, pausing after each one as if expecting a command to follow. And when none came, he took another, and the space began to change, not in structure, but in feeling, as if the land itself was teaching them something they had forgotten, that movement did not always require permission, and Daniel remained where he stood, watching, his hands relaxed at his sides, resisting the instinct to guide, to correct, to control, because this was not a mission, this was something else entirely, something that could not be forced, and Rex stayed close, not touching, but near enough that the space between them felt intentional, his ears flicking toward every small sound, every distant rustle, every unfamiliar detail, and yet his body was not tense, not guarded in the way it had been before. There was a steadiness there now, a quiet watchfulness that came not from duty, but from choice, and Daniel noticed it. Of course he did, because he had spent years reading signals that others missed, and he took a slow step forward, then another, not toward the house, not yet, but into the open yard, letting his boots press into the ground, letting the sound carry softly so they could follow if they chose, and behind him, the movement began again, subtle, almost hesitant, but real, paws shifting, bodies aligning, the loose circle forming once more, but this time it moved with him, not around him. And as the last light of day slipped below the horizon, the sky deepening into a quiet blue, the first signs of night settling in, a faint chill touched the air, and Daniel stopped, turning slightly, his gaze moving across them all, counting again without meaning to, not out of fear of losing them, but out of something deeper, something that had not yet found its place. And then he turned toward the house, the small porch light flickering on as if in quiet welcome, casting a warm glow across the entrance, and he walked toward it, slow, steady, not looking back, trusting that they would come, and they did, not all at once, not in perfect order, but enough to show that something had begun. And when he reached the steps, he paused, resting his hand briefly on the worn wooden railing, feeling the grain beneath his fingers, grounding himself in the present, and he opened the door, the hinges creaking softly, revealing a space that was simple, modest, not prepared for what it was about to hold. And he stepped inside, leaving it open behind him, not as an invitation spoken aloud, but as a choice. Left waiting, and outside, the dogs gathered at the threshold, their bodies still again, their eyes fixed on the doorway, on the light spilling out onto the ground. And Rex stepped forward first, his movement calm, deliberate, crossing the line without hesitation, and as he entered, he paused just inside, turning his head slightly as if to look back, not at the past, but at the others, and one by one, they followed, slower this time, more uncertain, but willing, and the house, quiet for so long, filled with the soft sound of movement, of breath, of life returning in small, careful steps. And Daniel stood in the center of it, not speaking, not directing, just present, as the space around him began to change, not because he forced it, but because they did, because together, without words, they were learning something new, something neither of them had been given before: how to stay, without being told to. The house did not know how to hold this many lives at once. Not yet. And the air inside shifted with every step they took, carrying the scent of wood, dust, and something older, something that had been still for too long. And the dogs moved slowly across the floor, their paws making soft, uncertain sounds against the worn boards, each step deliberate, measured, as if testing whether this place would remain or disappear like everything else before it. And Daniel stood near the center of the room, watching them without moving, letting them map the space in their own way, because this was not a place to command. This was a place to learn. And Rex moved first. Of course he did, his body low but steady, his nose lifting slightly as he traced the edges of the room, the corners, the shadows, reading everything with the quiet precision that had once made him exceptional. And one by one the others followed, spreading through the small space, some staying close to the walls, others pausing at doorways, peering into rooms that held nothing but emptiness and possibility. And the silence was not empty anymore. It was filled with breath, with presence, with the quiet rhythm of 17 hearts trying to understand something new. And Daniel finally took a step forward, his boots pressing softly against the floor, and he moved toward the kitchen, where a single overhead light cast a warm, steady glow. And he opened a cabinet, pulling out a stack of old metal bowls. Not enough for all of them, not yet, but enough to begin. And he set them down one by one, the soft clink of metal echoing gently through the house. And the sound drew their attention, not sharply, not urgently, but with curiosity. Heads turning, ears lifting, and Rex approached first, stopping a few feet away, watching, waiting. And Daniel crouched slightly, his movements calm, unhurried, as he filled one bowl, then another, the sound of water steady, grounding. And he placed them on the floor, stepping back immediately, giving space, always giving space. And for a moment no one moved, not because they did not understand, but because they were not used to being offered without condition, without command. And then Rex stepped forward, slow, deliberate, lowering his head just enough to sniff, to confirm. And when he took the first sip, it was quiet, almost careful, as if the act itself needed permission. And the others watched, waiting, learning. And then another stepped forward, then another, until the room filled with the soft sound of drinking, of movement, of something basic and necessary being accepted again. And Daniel remained where he was, leaning lightly against the counter, his arms relaxed at his sides, his eyes moving across them, not counting now, not measuring, just seeing. And something inside him shifted, something that had been held tight for too long. And the memory returned, not as a sharp pain, but as a quiet presence, the image of another dog, another time, a moment where he had not been fast enough, not strong enough, and the weight of it had followed him through every step since. But now, standing in this small kitchen filled with quiet life, it felt different, not gone, never gone, but changed, as if it no longer stood alone. And Rex lifted his head briefly, water still clinging to his muzzle, his eyes meeting Daniel's for just a second. And in that look there was no command, no expectation, just recognition. And Daniel nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, but enough to say something without words. And the house, once silent, now held a different kind of quiet, one that was not empty, not waiting, but alive, growing in small, steady ways. And outside the night settled fully, wrapping the land in stillness, while inside, under a single light, something began to take root, not loud, not immediate, but real, something that could not be undone, something that would carry forward into whatever came next. Because for the first time in a long time, none of them were waiting for an end, they were learning how to begin. The night settled gently around the house, not as something heavy, but as something protective, wrapping the quiet land in a stillness that felt earned rather than empty. And inside, the rhythm had changed, no longer uncertain, no longer fragile, but steady in a way that only comes when something begins to belong. And the dogs had found their places without being told, some lying near the walls where shadows felt familiar, others closer to the center where the warmth gathered, their bodies finally resting not from exhaustion, but from a quiet permission they had not known they needed. And Daniel moved through the room slowly, not checking, not inspecting, just passing among them with a presence that no longer felt foreign, his steps softer now, his breathing even, as if the weight he carried had found somewhere to settle. And Rex remained near him, not as a guard, not as a duty, but as something closer, something unspoken. His body stretched along the floor, his head resting lightly but his eyes still open, watching without tension, without demand. And Daniel paused beside him, lowering himself down until he sat on the worn wooden floor, his back against the wall, his hand resting loosely over his knee. And for a moment he said nothing, did nothing, just existed in the same space. And Rex shifted slightly, closing the small distance between them until his side pressed gently against Daniel's leg. A contact so natural it did not ask permission, and Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something inside finally loosens its hold. And he reached down, his hand finding the familiar line of the dog's neck, fingers resting there without urgency, without purpose beyond the simple act of being there. And the memory came again, but this time it did not pull him under, it did not sharpen or tighten, it simply arrived, quieter now, softer, like a voice that no longer needed to be heard loudly to be understood. And he closed his eyes for just a second, not to escape, but to accept. And when he opened them, the room was still there, the dogs were still there, Rex was still beside him, and something inside him had shifted in a way that did not need explanation. And across the room, one of the older shepherds let out a slow, deep sigh, the kind that comes from a body finally releasing its guard. And another followed, then another, a quiet chain of breath moving through the space like a shared understanding. And Daniel listened to it, not as sound, but as something deeper, something that carried meaning without words. And outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, brushing against the house with a faint whisper, and the porch light cast a steady glow through the window, illuminating the edges of a place that had once been empty and now held something real, something alive. And time passed without being counted, without being measured, until the night deepened fully and the silence settled into something complete. And Daniel remained where he was, not moving to a bed, not leaving the room, as if some part of him knew that this first night mattered, that presence was its own kind of promise. And Rex eventually closed his eyes, not all the way at first, but enough to rest, enough to trust. And one by one the others followed, their breathing slowing, their bodies easing into the floor, into the space, into the quiet. And the house held them all, not perfectly, not without its flaws, but enough to begin. And in that stillness, with no commands given and none expected, something had been restored, not through force, not through time alone, but through a choice made and kept. And though no one spoke it, not Daniel, not Rex, not any of the others, it was there, settled into the space between them, simple and steady, that no one in that room would be left behind again.